September 10th, 1957. Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, Harlem. Albert Anastasia's hit squad fired 12 rounds into Bumpy Johnson's Cadillac. The target, Bumpy. The body, his driver of 15 years. 45 days later. Anastasia was gone. Not revenge. Not rage. Strategy. How does a man survive an empire that just killed the wrong person and end the boss without pulling the trigger to understand that morning? We go back to the red light where it began. October 25th, 1957. The Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop in Manhattan smelled like bay rum and lemon oil. Like the kind of old-world establishment where men with money came to be groomed by professionals who understood that a proper shave required hot towels and sharp steel and silence that bordered on reverence. The marble floors gleamed under morning light that filtered through frosted glass, casting shadows that moved slightly when nothing in the room was actually moving. Albert Anastasia sat in chair number 4, the one positioned farthest from the entrance, the one that allowed him to see the door through the mirror while his back was to the wall. The hot towel covered his face from hairline to collar, blocking his vision but providing the kind of heat that loosened pores and prepared skin for the blade. Arthur Grasso, the barber, moved with practiced efficiency, understanding that conversation was neither expected nor desired. The sound of scissors touching chrome created a rhythm that was almost musical. The smell of shaving soap mixed with the scent of polished wood from the paneling that covered walls designed to muffle sound. Then the door opened. 2 men entered wearing long coats despite the October warmth. The morning's careful ritual shattered into something that would be remembered for reasons Arthur Grasso would spend the rest of his life wishing he could forget. The first gunman raised his weapon. "This is for every man you sent to the grave," he said, his voice flat and final. The tone of someone delivering a sentence that had already been decided in rooms where mercy was not a factor anyone considered. 3 shots hit Anastasia's chest before he could process that the sounds were gunfire. The bullets punched through the towel, tore through his sternum, shredded his aorta, continued through the leather chair backing. Anastasia's hands clawed at the armrests, his body trying to stand, trying to fight, trying to do anything except accept what was happening. He lunged forward out of the chair, reached for the mirror as if his reflection could somehow help him, as if grabbing at glass could change what the bullets had already decided. His skull cracked against the marble floor with a sound like a melon splitting. Wet and final. The second gunman stepped closer, aimed carefully at the back of Anastasia's head. "Tell the devil we sent you," the second man said, and fired twice more. The bullets entered at the base of Anastasia's skull, exited through his face, took bone and tissue with them that scattered across the white marble in patterns that Arthur Grasso would see every time he closed his eyes for the next 40 years. The Lord High Executioner, the man who had ordered hundreds of murders, who had built Murder Incorporated into an organization that contracted killings, like legitimate businesses contracted accounting, lay twitching on a barbershop floor while his nervous system received its final instructions from a brain that was no longer capable of sending coherent signals. He died at 10:23, 3 minutes after the first bullet entered his chest, drowning in fluids that were supposed to stay inside arteries and lungs, but were now filling spaces that had never been designed to accommodate them. The gunman walked out calmly, got into a car that was waiting with its engine running, drove away before police could respond. But this story does not begin in a Manhattan barbershop where a powerful man learned that power has limits. This story begins 45 days earlier, in Harlem, where a different kind of violence produced consequences that would ripple through New York's criminal structure. Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem's policy operations in 1957, had been controlling them since the 1930s when he helped Stephanie St. Clair resist Dutch Schultz. He was 51 years old, not tall, not physically imposing, But he moved through Harlem with quiet confidence. His face showed no emotion that he did not want it to show. His words were chosen carefully. His decisions were made after calculation rather than during rage. Jerome Washington had been Bumpy's driver for 15 years. He was 43 years old, had a wife and 2 daughters, was saving money to buy a house in Queens where his children could grow up in a neighborhood with better schools. He had saved Bumpy's life twice. Once in 1948, when a contract killer had approached Bumpy's car at a stoplight, and Jerome had seen the gun and accelerated through the intersection before the shooter could fire. And once in 1953, when Jerome had noticed that someone had tampered with the brake lines and had refused to start the engine until mechanics verified the car was safe. Albert Anastasia was the boss of what would become the Gambino crime family. Was called the Lord High Executioner because he had personally participated in dozens of murders and had ordered hundreds more. He was 55 years old. In 1957 had survived multiple wars, had built a reputation for being both powerful and unpredictable. Carlo Gambino was Anastasia's underboss, was quiet, was patient, was ambitious in ways he kept carefully hidden because ambitious underlings who show their ambition too openly tend to have accidents. He watched Anastasia make mistakes, watched the boss attract attention from law enforcement, watched and calculated and waited. Vito Genovese ran his own family, was consolidating power. Meyer Lansky was the financial genius who connected Italian and Jewish criminals, who operated casinos in Cuba and Florida. Both men were watching the situation with Anastasia, calculating whether he was an asset or a liability. September 10th, 1957. 45 days before Albert Anastasia would die in a barber's chair. A black Cadillac stopped at a red light at Lenox Avenue and 135th Street in Harlem. Engine idling, driver waiting for the signal to change. The shooter approached from the sidewalk, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how long it would take. He raised a revolver, aimed through the driver's side window, and squeezed the trigger 6 times in rapid succession. The first bullet entered Jerome Washington's temple, penetrated his skull, tore through his brain, exited through the opposite side, taking fragments of bone with it. The second hit his neck, severed his carotid artery, produced a spray that painted the interior of the car in seconds. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth bullets hit his chest and shoulder. Redundant damage to a man who was already gone, but ensuring that if the first shots had somehow failed to kill him, the subsequent ones would finish the job. The Cadillac drifted forward as Jerome's foot came off the brake, rolled through the intersection, collided gently with a parked delivery truck. The engine was still running. The radio was still playing. Jerome Washington was slumped over the steering wheel with 6 bullets in him, his face pressed against the horn, creating a sound that would bring witnesses who had somehow not heard the gunshots or had heard them and decided that investigating was a good way to become the next victim. Wrong target, wrong person, wrong calculation by an organization that had been so confident in their intelligence that they had not verified whether the man they were killing was actually the man they intended to kill. Albert Anastasia had ordered Bumpy Johnson eliminated, had given the contract to soldiers who were supposed to be professional enough to identify their target, had assumed that the man driving Bumpy's usual car at Bumpy's usual time would be Bumpy rather than the driver who had borrowed the car that morning. That mistake started a countdown that would end 45 days later in a Manhattan barbershop, where Albert Anastasia would learn that some mistakes cannot be corrected and some debts cannot be paid with apologies or money. Jerome Washington died at 9:47 in the morning. Not because anyone wanted him dead, but because he had been driving the wrong car at the wrong time. He died before his brain could process the sound of the first shot or the pain of the first bullet. His last thought was probably about whether the light would change soon so he could continue to the bakery where he was supposed to pick up bread for his daughter's breakfast. Detective Williams arrived at 9:55, looked at the body slumped over the steering wheel, recognized immediately that this was not a robbery or a dispute. "This is organized," he said to his partner. "Detective Morrison. This is professional. 6 shots. All fatal placement. No witnesses. No useful evidence. This is a contract. Killing. And the question is whether they hit the right target." They identified Jerome Washington through his wallet, through the photograph of his family on the dashboard. They contacted his wife, told her that her husband would not be coming home, that her daughters would grow up without a father because someone had made a calculation error. Bumpy Johnson was downtown when Jerome died, was in a meeting discussing policy operations. The news reached him at 10:30 through a phone call that said only, "There has been an incident involving your driver," in a tone that communicated everything that needed communicating without wasting words on euphemisms. He finished his meeting because leaving abruptly would signal weakness. He drove back to Harlem in a different car, arrived at the intersection where Jerome had been killed, stood on the sidewalk looking at the Cadillac surrounded by police tape. Illinois Gordon met him there. "They were aiming for you," Gordon said, his voice flat. "Wrong car, wrong timing, right location, professional hit. Poor intelligence. They killed Jerome thinking he was you." Bumpy's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, curled into fists that he forced himself to uncurl because showing emotion in public was showing weakness, and weakness invited further attacks. "Who ordered it?" "Anastasia. Word is already moving through channels. His people are realizing their mistake. They will be reaching out to apologize, to offer compensation." Bumpy said nothing, stood looking at the car where Jerome Washington had spent his final seconds, calculating what response would serve his interests better than emotion. 5 days later, a messenger arrived at Small's Paradise carrying an envelope. The club was closed. The smell of 1934 Barolo lingered in the air, mixed with cigar smoke. Bumpy sat at his usual table, positioned so he could see both entrances, his back to a reinforced wall. The messenger was nervous, was young enough that he probably had not been present during the era when mistakes like killing the wrong man produced immediate consequences. "Mr. Anastasia sends his deepest apologies for the unfortunate incident involving your driver," the messenger said, using words he had been given. "It was a tragic error, a failure of intelligence that should never have occurred. As a gesture of goodwill and compensation, Mr. Anastasia is prepared to provide $50,000 to the family of Jerome Washington." $50,000 was a significant sum in 1957, was more than most men earned in a decade, was enough to buy a house and fund education for 2 daughters. It was a serious offer, was the kind of compensation that acknowledged genuine regret. Bumpy listened without interrupting, without showing any reaction. He let silence fill the room for exactly 15 seconds. Let the messenger become uncomfortable. Let the weight of expectation build. "Tell Mr. Anastasia I appreciate his offer," Bumpy said finally, his voice carrying no anger, no grief, only cold precision. "Tell him I understand that mistakes occur, that intelligence failures are unfortunate but inevitable. Tell him I recognize his gesture as genuine and his compensation as generous." The messenger relaxed slightly, believing acceptance was coming. "But tell him I am declining his offer," Bumpy continued, and the messenger's expression shifted from relief to confusion to fear. "Tell him that some things cannot be purchased. Tell him that Jerome Washington saved my life twice. Tell him that $50,000 will not buy back the man who drove my daughters to school every morning when I could not. Tell him that money does not resurrect fathers or restore families or undo the sound of 6 bullets entering a skull. Mr. Johnson, the messenger said, his voice uncertain, I do not think Mr. Anastasia will accept that response. I do not think he will understand what resolution you are suggesting. Then let me be very clear, Bumpy said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a register that made the temperature in the room feel like it had fallen 10 degrees. Tell him I am not coming to Brooklyn. Tell him I am not sending soldiers to his home. Tell him I am not starting a war that will fill cemeteries on both sides. But tell him this in 45 days. He will understand exactly what my refusal means. In 45 days. Someone will put bullets in him the way his people put bullets in Jerome. And when it happens, when he is bleeding out on some floor somewhere wondering how he miscalculated, tell him to remember this conversation. Tell him to remember that I warned him. Tell him to remember that I gave him 45 days to feel what I felt when I stood on that corner looking at my driver's body. The messenger's face went pale. You are threatening Mr. Anastasia. You understand who he is. You understand what he has done to people who threaten him. I am not threatening him, Bumpy said, his voice still calm, still measured, still carrying the kind of certainty that comes from having already calculated every variable and reached an inevitable conclusion. I am making a prediction. I am telling him that in 45 days, his own people will kill him. Not me. Not my soldiers. His people. Because I am going to spend the next 45 days making sure they understand that he is a problem that needs solving. I am going to take every weakness he has, every enemy he has made, every mistake he has committed, and I am going to amplify it until the people who protect him decide that protecting him costs more than killing him. The messenger left, carrying words that would be delivered to Albert Anastasia within 2 hours, carrying a message that would be analyzed and ultimately dismissed as emotional posturing from someone who had lost a loyal employee. Illinois Gordon, who had been standing in the corner during the entire conversation, stepped forward after the door closed. You are going to kill him. I am not going to kill him, Bumpy corrected. I am going to make his own people kill him. I am going to turn him into a problem that needs solving. And I am going to let the people who solve problems professionally conclude that he needs solving. I am not starting a war. I am simply making sure that the war that is already starting ends with the correct person losing. 45 days, Gordon said. 45 days is what it will take, Bumpy confirmed. It will take that long to gather what I need, to position it correctly, to make sure that when he falls, everyone understands it was inevitable and justified. Jerome Washington was worth more than $50,000. Jerome Washington was worth making sure that the man who ordered his death learns what it costs to make that kind of mistake. The countdown had started. 45 days until Albert Anastasia would sit in a barber's chair thinking he was safe, thinking his power protected him, thinking that mistakes could be resolved with money and apologies. 45 days until Bumpy Johnson would demonstrate that some mistakes cannot be corrected, and some debts are paid in ways that money cannot purchase. Albert Anastasia had survived 30 years in organized crime, had personally put ice picks through the skulls of men who crossed him in the 1930s, had ordered executions with the same casual indifference that other men ordered lunch. But surviving that long creates patterns, creates vulnerabilities, creates the kind of accumulated enemies and resentments that smart operators learn to manage and stupid operators ignore until those resentments become fatal. Bumpy Johnson spent the first 5 days after Jerome Washington's murder documenting what he already knew about Anastasia's situation, compiling information that existed in various places but had never been assembled into a single, coherent picture. The vulnerabilities were there, had been there for years, but they existed as separate problems rather than as connected weaknesses. Internal dissatisfaction within the Gambino family. Carlo Gambino was not the only ambitious underboss who believed he could run the family better, but he was the most patient, the most connected, the most capable of waiting for the right moment. Other soldiers were tired of Anastasia's volatility, were concerned about his tendency to make decisions based on rage rather than strategy. In private conversations in social clubs where men drank espresso and discussed business that would never be mentioned in federal wiretaps, the same complaints appeared repeatedly. The boss was becoming unpredictable, was making moves that attracted attention, was enriching himself while soldiers struggled to earn. He is taking 40% when the agreement is 25%. One soldier told a bookkeeper who worked for both the Gambino family and for policy operations that connected to Harlem. He is skimming from the waterfront, skimming from the casinos, skimming from everything. And when we complain, he reminds us what he did to the last person who complained. But you cannot run a family on fear forever. Eventually, someone gets tired of being afraid and decides that dead bosses do not inspire as much fear as living ones. Financial irregularities that suggested systematic theft rather than the traditional boss's privilege of taking a larger share. Bumpy's people gathered ledgers, copied records, documented discrepancies between what soldiers reported earning and what actually got distributed. The numbers told a story of someone who had stopped thinking about the long-term health of the organization and started thinking only about immediate personal enrichment. Money that should have been invested in legitimate businesses was being spent on personal luxuries. Money that should have been distributed to soldiers who had families to feed was disappearing into accounts that only Anastasia could access. Federal investigation into waterfront operations. The FBI had been targeting labor racketeering since 1956, had been building cases against union corruption. Anastasia's visible presence in waterfront operations made him a natural target. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Subpoenas were being prepared. The kind of attention that made it difficult for other families to operate quietly. The kind of publicity that bosses were supposed to avoid because publicity brings prosecutors, and prosecutors bring indictments. He is on television. Vito Genovese complained to an associate who would mention it to another associate who would mention it to someone who knew someone in Harlem. He is giving interviews to reporters. He is acting like he wants to be famous. Famous criminals go to prison or they go to cemeteries. Those are the only two destinations for people who cannot operate quietly. Conflict with Meyer Lansky over Cuban casino operations. Anastasia wanted a larger share of Havana gambling revenue. Believed his position entitled him to more influence. Lansky disagreed. Had his own vision for Cuban operations that did not include giving Anastasia control over investments that Lansky had spent years developing. The tension had escalated from disagreement to open hostility, had reached the point where both men were making threats that sounded like prelude to violence. Tell Anastasia that if he sends people to Cuba to cause problems, those people will return in boxes. Lansky told an intermediary who carried messages between New York and Havana. Tell him that casinos require stability, that investors require confidence, that confidence disappears when bosses start wars over percentages. Tell him that I have been patient. But patience has limits, and those limits are approaching rapidly. Catched Carlo Gambino's quiet ambition and his connections to other families. Gambino had been cultivating relationships with Vito Genovese, with Tommy Lucchese, with the bosses who would need to approve or at least accept a change in Gambino family leadership. He was positioning himself as the reasonable alternative, as the steady hand that could manage operations more professionally, as the person who would restore stability. Carlo is a good earner, Genovese told his consigliere during a conversation that would be repeated to other families through channels that existed specifically for this kind of information sharing. Carlo is smart. Carlo understands that this business requires staying out of newspapers and avoiding federal investigations. If something were to happen to Anastasia, if the family needed new leadership, Carlo would have my support. These 5 vulnerabilities existed independently, were known to various people in various contexts, but had not been connected into a narrative that demonstrated Anastasia was not just vulnerable, but was actively dangerous. Bumpy's objective over the next 40 days was to amplify existing problems until they became impossible to ignore, to connect separate weaknesses into a pattern that would lead other people to conclude that Albert Anastasia needed to be removed. The campaign was divided into 4 phases, each one building on the previous phase, each one designed to make Anastasia's position more precarious without any action that could be traced back to Bumpy. Phase 1. Gather financial documentation. This required access to people who handled money within the Gambino family, required identifying bookkeepers who were dissatisfied enough that they might provide information. Bumpy used intermediaries, used people who did business with both Harlem and Brooklyn, used the network of gamblers and loan sharks who moved between worlds. "I need records," Bumpy told a man named Samuel Rothstein, who kept books for 3 different families and had a reputation for being discreet but also for being available to people who paid well for information. "I need documentation of what Anastasia is taking versus what he is supposed to be taking. I need numbers that demonstrate pattern rather than isolated incidents. I need evidence that would concern soldiers who are already suspicious." "That kind of information gets people killed," Rothstein said, his voice carrying the caution of someone who had survived 40 years in a business where curiosity could be fatal. "That kind of information means I am taking sides in something that could end very badly for people on the wrong side." "You will be compensated appropriately," Bumpy said, sliding an envelope across the table that contained $5,000 in cash, with the promise of another $10,000 when the information was delivered. "And you will never be identified as the source. The information will appear to come from internal family sources, from people who have their own reasons to be unhappy. You are simply a courier who happened to have access to records that tell an interesting story." The information came slowly, came in pieces over 2 weeks, records of waterfront collections that did not match what soldiers reported earning, discrepancies in casino percentages from Florida and Cuba operations, patterns of money being moved through accounts that belonged to Anastasia personally. None of it was definitive proof by itself, but assembled together it created a picture of systematic theft that would concern anyone who depended on fair distribution. Phase 2. Amplify internal dissatisfaction by ensuring rumors about financial irregularities reach soldiers who were already questioning Anastasia's leadership. This was delicate work. Required making sure the information appeared to come from internal sources rather than external antagonists. "You hear what I heard about the waterfront numbers?" One of Bumpy's intermediaries asked a Gambino soldier during a dice game in Brooklyn, speaking casually as if mentioning something that was common knowledge rather than intelligence that had been carefully planted. "You hear that the collections are coming in at $60,000 a month, but only $40,000 is getting reported to the family. You hear where that other $20,000 is going?" The soldier had not heard, but now that he had heard, he would mention it to other soldiers, who would mention it to their associates, until the rumor was circulating within the Gambino family as though it had originated there. The pattern repeated across multiple topics, multiple complaints, multiple pieces of information that individually seemed like normal gossip, but collectively built a narrative of a boss who was enriching himself while his soldiers struggled. Phase 3. Provide information anonymously to journalists and federal investigators. Bumpy used lawyers who represented both legitimate clients and criminal clients. Used people who could claim to have stumbled across information rather than having gathered it deliberately. "I have something that might interest your investigation," an anonymous caller told an FBI agent who was working on waterfront corruption cases. "I have records that show systematic skimming from union pension funds. I have documentation of payoffs to union officials. I have evidence that the money is going to specific individuals in specific crime families. I cannot identify myself, but I can tell you where to look and what to look for." Articles began appearing in newspapers about waterfront corruption, about union officials living beyond their means, about mysterious ownership structures in Florida casinos. None of the articles mentioned Anastasia by name because libel laws prevented that. But anyone reading them and connecting them to existing knowledge about who controlled waterfront operations would reach obvious conclusions. Phase 4. Ensure that the other families would not object to Anastasia's removal. This required different intermediaries, required people who could carry messages to multiple families without those messages appearing to be coordinated. Anastasia is becoming a liability, one message said, delivered to a Genovese capo through a lawyer who handled disputes between families. He is attracting law enforcement attention that makes it difficult for everyone to operate. He is creating financial irregularities that undermine trust. He is generating conflicts with Lansky over Cuba that could produce problems for everyone who has casino interests. If someone within the Gambino family decided that leadership change was necessary, would the commission object? The responses came back through the same channels, came carefully worded, but consistent. The commission would not object to internal resolution of internal problems. The commission trusted Carlo Gambino to manage family affairs appropriately. The commission believed that stability was more important than loyalty to any individual boss. By day 25 of the countdown, Albert Anastasia was isolated in ways he did not fully understand. He began to recognize that something was wrong, began to increase security, began to change routines. "Why are you varying the schedule?" his driver asked one morning when Anastasia told him to take a different route to Brooklyn than the route they had been using for years. "Because I am not stupid," Anastasia snapped, his paranoia showing in ways that confirmed to everyone watching that he had lost the confidence required to lead effectively. "Because people are talking. Because I can feel it when loyalty shifts. Change the route. Change it every day. And find out who is spreading rumors about me. Because when I find them, I'm going to cut their tongues out and mail them to their families as lessons about what happens to people who talk." But those defensive measures, those visible signs of fear, made his situation worse rather than better. A boss who increases security is a boss who fears his own people. A boss who threatens to cut out tongues is a boss who has lost control through methods other than intimidation. By day 30, the isolation was complete. Anastasia was powerful but alone, was protected but vulnerable, was in command but losing control, and the people who made decisions about who lived and who died in New York's criminal structure were watching and reaching conclusions that Bumpy Johnson had spent 30 days positioning them to reach. Carlo Gambino sat in a social club on Mulberry Street drinking espresso that had gone cold while he pretended to read a newspaper. He was 40 years old, had been Anastasia's underboss for 6 years, had spent those years watching his boss make mistakes that competent leaders avoid and wondering when the right moment would arrive to correct those mistakes permanently. He had a position. He was underboss, was second in command, was the person who managed daily operations while Anastasia handled strategy that increasingly produced more problems than profits. He had authority over captains, had relationships with soldiers, had spent years building loyalty through fair treatment rather than through fear-based management that Anastasia preferred. He had ambition. Everyone knew this, though Gambino never stated it directly. But ambition in an underboss is like pregnancy. You can deny it, but eventually it becomes visible. The question was not whether Gambino wanted to be boss. The question was whether he was smart enough to wait for the right moment rather than forcing a confrontation that would get him killed. He had tacit support. Conversations where Anastasia was not present had made clear that many people believed leadership change would benefit everyone. Soldiers were tired of volatility, were concerned about law enforcement attention, were calculating whether their futures were brighter under different management. But all of this was theoretical, until Gambino was certain that the commission would not retaliate. The commission coordinated the 5 families, resolved disputes, approved major decisions like removing sitting bosses. Without commission approval, Removing Anastasia would trigger a war that might be won but would damage everyone involved. The signals came through intermediaries that Bumpy Johnson had been using for weeks, came through lawyers and accountants who moved between worlds. The first signal came from Vito Genovese's consigliere, delivered during a conversation about construction projects, inserted casually as if it were an afterthought. If there were to be changes in family leadership, the consigliere said, if internal matters required internal resolution, Don Genovese would view such matters as internal business that did not require commission intervention. He believes families should manage their own affairs without external interference, particularly when those affairs involve correcting situations that have become problematic for everyone. Gambino processed this without visible reaction, continued discussing construction, as if the real message had not just been delivered. Genovese would not object. Genovese would not intervene. Genovese might even approve. The second signal came from Meyer Lansky, came more directly because Lansky was not Italian and was not bound by the same protocols. Lansky sent his lawyer, Morris Levy, who met with Gambino under the pretense of discussing gambling revenues. Meyer has concerns about Albert, Levy said bluntly. He has concerns about the Cuba situation, about tensions making it difficult to operate casinos that require stability. He wanted me to make clear that if circumstances were to change, if leadership were to transition to someone who understood how to maintain partnerships without creating unnecessary conflicts, Meyer would view that transition favorably. This was as close to explicit approval as Gambino would receive. Two of the most powerful voices in New York's criminal structure had indicated they would not object. The third signal came from Tommy Lucchese, who ran his own family and served as mediator between bosses. Lucchese invited Gambino to dinner at an expensive restaurant, spent 2 hours discussing nothing important before addressing the actual reason for the meeting. The commission has been discussing stability, Lucchese said, swirling wine in his glass. We have been discussing what stability requires, what threatens it. We have been discussing whether current leadership in certain families is contributing to stability or undermining it through behavior that attracts attention and creates conflicts. He paused, made sure Gambino understood this was official communication. The commission believes families should resolve their own internal matters without external interference. The commission trusts that capable underbosses understand their responsibilities, understand when leadership change serves everyone's interests, understand how to manage transitions without producing chaos. I understand, Gambino said, his voice carrying professional acknowledgement. I understand that stability is paramount. I understand that families must manage their own affairs. I understand that leadership transitions, when they become necessary, should be handled professionally. Then we understand each other, Lucchese said, raising his glass in a gesture that was both toast and approval. With those 3 signals received, Carlo Gambino had what he needed. The commission would not object. Genovese would not intervene. Lansky would welcome the change. The path was clear. The obstacles had been removed. The authorization had been given. What Gambino did not know was that someone else had been orchestrating the conditions that made his move possible. Someone else had been gathering evidence and amplifying complaints and ensuring that the signals he received came at exactly the right time. Someone else had been playing a longer game on a larger board, moving pieces that Gambino thought were moving independently. Bumpy Johnson sat in Harlem watching pieces move on a chessboard that most players did not realize existed. He had not communicated directly with Gambino, had created no traceable connection. He had simply created conditions, had amplified existing problems, had made sure that when Gambino looked for approval, he found it. By day 35, the political preparation was complete. Gambino had approval. The commission would not interfere. All that remained was timing, was finding the right moment when Anastasia would be vulnerable. But while Gambino prepared, External pressure was increasing. Federal investigations were accelerating, moving from preliminary inquiries to active prosecutions. Newspaper articles were appearing with increasing frequency, connecting Anastasia to waterfront corruption in ways that made it difficult for politicians to ignore. A particularly damaging article appeared in the New York Times on day 38. Detailed systematic corruption at Brooklyn docks, included quotes from union officials who claimed they were being forced to pay tribute to organized crime. The article did not name Anastasia directly, but included enough detail that anyone familiar with waterfront operations knew exactly who was being discussed. "He has become a political liability," one federal prosecutor told another, in a conversation that reached people who would find it useful. "He has become the kind of visible target that allows us to demonstrate we are serious about combating organized crime. We are going to indict him. We are going to try him, and we are going to send him to prison." This federal pressure created urgency that served Gambino's interests, created a timeline that made action necessary rather than optional. If Anastasia was indicted, the leadership transition would become complicated by questions about whether he retained authority while imprisoned. "It needs to happen soon," one of Gambino's captains said during a meeting where the subject was never explicitly stated. "It needs to happen before the indictments come down, before he gets arrested, before this becomes even more complicated. Every day we wait is another day where something could go wrong." "It will happen when it happens," Gambino said calmly. "It will happen when the conditions are exactly right, when he is vulnerable, when the risk is minimized, when everyone involved understands their role and executes it professionally." By day 40, Albert Anastasia had become exactly what Bumpy Johnson had been working to make him become, had transformed from a powerful boss into a political liability that everyone wanted removed, but no one wanted to be seen removing. He was isolated within his own family, was facing federal prosecution, was creating conflicts with other families that threatened business relationships. He was wearing armor that had become too heavy to carry, was wielding power that had become too expensive to maintain. And he did not understand that the pressure he was feeling had been orchestrated by someone he had wronged 40 days earlier when he ordered a hit that killed the wrong man. Day 43, 72 hours before Albert Anastasia would die in a barber's chair. He woke at 5 in the morning in his home in Fort Lee, New Jersey, in a bedroom secured with reinforced doors and bulletproof windows and surveillance systems. He had not slept well, had been waking every hour, had been experiencing persistent anxiety that comes when your subconscious understands something your conscious mind has not yet articulated. Something was wrong. He knew this with the certainty that comes from surviving 30 years in an occupation where men who ignored their instincts ended up in morgues or prisons. He did not know what was wrong, did not know where the threat was coming from, did not know who had betrayed him. He only knew that the world that had been familiar 40 days ago had become strange and threatening. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the street, watching for surveillance, watching for cars that did not belong. The street was empty, was quiet, showed no signs of immediate threat. But the absence of visible threats did not provide comfort because the most dangerous threats are the ones you cannot see. "You are being paranoid," his wife said from the bed, her voice exhausted. "You are seeing threats where no threats exist. You are making yourself sick with worry." "They are real," Anastasia said, his eyes never leaving the window. "I can feel it. I have felt it before. Felt it in 1931 before the Castellammarise War. You survive by listening to what your gut tells you, and my gut is telling me that someone is moving against me in ways I cannot see. But feeling threats and identifying them are different skills." Anastasia had spent 43 days feeling increasingly isolated, without understanding why isolation was increasing or who was orchestrating it. He had increased security, had changed routines, had stopped trusting people he had worked with for years. But these defensive measures had not made him feel safer, had not reduced the anxiety. Day 44. 48 hours before the barber's chair. Anastasia met with Carlo Gambino in a restaurant in Brooklyn to discuss family business, to review operations, to address concerns that soldiers had been raising. "The men are concerned," Gambino said, his voice carrying no emotion except professional reporting. "They are concerned about federal attention. They are concerned about newspaper articles. They are concerned about whether our operations can continue functioning if law enforcement pressure continues increasing." "The men are always concerned," Anastasia said, his voice carrying irritation. "The men worry because worrying is easier than working. Tell the men that I have been managing federal pressure since before most of them were born, that their job is to follow orders and collect money, while my job is to handle political complications." "I will tell them," Gambino said, his face showing professional neutrality. "But I would suggest that perhaps some adjustments might be useful, might reduce profile, might make it easier to operate without generating attention." "What kind of adjustments?" Anastasia asked, his voice suggesting he interpreted suggestions as criticism and criticism as disloyalty. "Smaller operations, less visibility, more careful selection of partners. The things that families who operate successfully do when they recognize that conditions have changed." Anastasia's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists. "You are telling me how to run this family. You are suggesting that I do not understand how to manage operations that I built. You are implying that my methods are outdated." "I am not suggesting anything," Gambino said, his voice remaining calm. "I am simply reporting what soldiers are saying, what concerns they are expressing. I am underboss. Reporting concerns is my responsibility." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, became increasingly strained, ended with Anastasia leaving convinced that even his underboss was questioning his leadership. He did not understand that the conversation had been orchestrated specifically to produce that reaction, that Gambino had been carefully calibrating his words to increase paranoia without triggering immediate confrontation. Day 45. 24 hours before the barber's chair. Anastasia woke even earlier than usual, checked his security systems more carefully, spent 20 minutes examining his car before allowing his driver to start the engine because car bombs were a traditional method for removing people who had become problems. At 9 o'clock, he called his lawyer, Arthur Schwartz, who specialized in defending organized crime figures against federal prosecution. "What is the situation with the waterfront investigation?" Anastasia asked, his voice carrying controlled urgency. "The situation is that they have a lot of evidence, and they are preparing to use it," Schwartz said bluntly. "They have cooperating witnesses. They have financial records. They have surveillance. They are building a comprehensive case, which means when they finally move, they will have evidence that will be very difficult to defend against." "How long before they indict?" "Weeks, maybe a month. They are presenting to a grand jury, but it is coming. And when it comes, you should be prepared for very serious charges." Anastasia hung up, sat in his office staring at walls that had provided shelter for years, but that now felt like they were closing in, like they were becoming a cell rather than a refuge. He had one habit remaining, one ritual that still provided a moment of relaxation, one routine that he refused to abandon. Every Friday morning at 10:30, he went to the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop, sat in chair number 4, received a shave and a haircut from Arthur Grasso. 45 minutes where he could close his eyes, where he could relax, where he could stop calculating threats. Barbershops were neutral territory, and attacking someone in a barbershop violated protocols that even the most ruthless criminals generally respected. October 25th, 1957, Day 45. The morning of Albert Anastasia's appointment with consequences that had been building for 6 weeks. Anastasia woke at his usual time, went through his usual routine, checked his usual security measures, found nothing that suggested today would be different from any other Friday. At 10:15, he arrived at the Park Sheraton, walked through the lobby, entered the barbershop where Arthur Grasso was preparing chair number 4. Anastasia sat, allowed the hot towel to be placed over his face, allowed himself to relax. The door opened at 10:17. 2 men entered wearing long coats. Arthur Grasso looked up, started to say that the shop was closed for a private appointment, stopped speaking when he saw what the men were carrying. The first gunman raised his weapon, aimed at the man in chair number 4, whose face was covered by a towel. "This is for every man you sent to the grave," the gunman said, and squeezed the trigger 3 times. The bullets punched through Anastasia's chest, tore through his sternum, shredded his aorta. Anastasia's hands clawed at the armrests, his body trying to stand, trying to fight. He lunged forward, reached for the mirror, his skull cracking against the marble floor with a sound like a melon splitting. The second gunman stepped closer, aimed at the back of Anastasia's head. "Tell the devil we sent you," he said, and fired twice more. The bullets entered at the base of Anastasia's skull, exited through his face, took bone and tissue that scattered across white marble. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, died at 10:23, 3 minutes after the first bullet entered his chest, 45 days after Jerome Washington died at a stoplight in Harlem. He died learning that power is temporary and mistakes are permanent, and some debts cannot be paid with money or apologies. 3 days after Albert Anastasia died, Bumpy Johnson drove to Queens carrying an envelope that contained $100,000 in cash, twice the amount that Anastasia had offered. He knocked on Mrs. Washington's door, waited while she looked through the peephole and decided whether to open it. She opened the door, her face showing exhaustion that comes from 6 weeks of grief and uncertainty. "Mr. Johnson," she said warily. "Mrs. Washington," Bumpy said, removing his hat. "I came to bring you something that belonged to Jerome, something he had been setting aside for your family's future." He handed her the envelope, watched her open it, watched her face change as she processed the amount of money. "This is too much," she said. "Jerome was saving, but he did not have this much saved." "Jerome had life insurance through the organization," Bumpy said gently. "This is what he earned, what he was owed, what you and your daughters are entitled to receive because he gave 15 years of loyal service and gave his life doing a job that I asked him to do." "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for remembering him, for taking care of his family." Bumpy said nothing else, simply nodded and turned and walked back to his car and drove back to Harlem. Carlo Gambino became boss in November 1957, assumed control without resistance. Without war, without chaos. The commission approved the transition, recognized that internal business had been resolved internally. Gambino ran the family for 19 years, built it into the most powerful criminal organization in America, operated with low-profile professionalism, died of natural causes in 1976. He sent a wreath to Bumpy Johnson's funeral in 1968, with a card that said only, "In recognition of mutual respect and shared understanding." Vito Genovese maintained his position until his arrest in 1959, died in prison in 1969. He never moved against Harlem, maintained the distance that strategic operators maintain when they recognize that some territories are more trouble than they are worth. Meyer Lansky continued operating casinos until Castro's revolution forced him to relocate to the Bahamas and eventually to Las Vegas. He died in 1983, having never been successfully prosecuted. Murder Incorporated faded from prominence after Anastasia's death, was dissolved gradually as families decided that outsourcing violence was less reliable than handling enforcement internally. Bumpy Johnson continued running Harlem's policy operations until his death from a heart attack in 1968, maintained control through the same combination of intelligence and strategic thinking that had allowed him to survive Dutch Schultz in 1935 and Albert Anastasia in 1957. The lesson of those 45 days lived on in the memories of people who had watched it unfold, who had seen how strategic thinking could produce outcomes that violence alone could never achieve, who had learned that power came in multiple forms, and the most dangerous form was the kind that operated through influence and information rather than through guns and muscle. A driver died because someone made a targeting error. 45 days later, a boss died because that error had consequences that went beyond the immediate loss. Because some men understand that revenge is not about matching violence with violence, but about creating conditions where your enemies remove themselves through their own mistakes and vulnerabilities. Real power does not come from violence. Bumpy told Illinois Gordon on the day they heard that Anastasia was dead. Real power comes from understanding who controls violence and making sure they decide that your interests and their interests align closely enough that helping you serves them. Real power comes from making your enemies into problems that other people solve. Jerome would have appreciated this, Gordon said. He would have appreciated knowing that his death was not meaningless, that it produced consequences for the person who ordered it. Jerome deserved better than dying at a stoplight because someone could not verify a target, Bumpy said, his voice carrying cold acknowledgement that outcomes had been achieved, but achievements did not resurrect the dead. But since we could not give him his life back, we gave him something else. We gave him justice delivered through methods that kept everyone in Harlem safe, that did not start wars or produce casualties. We made sure that the person responsible paid the price, and we made sure that price got paid by people who had their own reasons to collect it. The world continued turning. The policy games continued operating. The families continued cooperating and competing. And in Harlem, people who had watched Bumpy Johnson navigate 2 wars without firing shots learned lessons about power and strategy, and the difference between being strong and being smart, and why being smart was usually better when you were trying to survive. You can buy many things with money, but you cannot buy back strategic mistakes once they have been made and their consequences have been set in motion. Albert Anastasia learned this in a barber's chair on October 25th. 1957 learned it too late to act on the knowledge, but hopefully early enough that the lesson registered before his brain stopped processing information and his body stopped performing the functions that separate the living from the dead. This story is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. Thank you for watching until the end. These stories take weeks of research and writing to create. If this resonated with you, if you see the lesson Bumpy Johnson was teaching about accountability and education over violence, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach 1 million subscribers so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories about power used wisely. Stories about consequences faced honestly. Stories about men who chose to change systems instead of just destroying enemies. The next video drops soon. Until then, remember, real power is not what you can destroy. It is what you choose to build.